Welcome. I'm Dr. Vinay Prasad. I'm a hematologist-oncologist, and I'm Associate Professor of Medicine at the University of California, San Francisco. In my professional life, I see patients, I teach trainees, and I do research in healthcare policy. This is Plenary Session. Plenary Session is a podcast at the intersection of medicine, oncology, and health policy, and you're listening to Season 3. On this week's episode, first up, listener questions. You won't want to miss this. Then, I'm joined by Dr. Bishal Gyawali, and we're going to talk about recent events in the news. So, we've got quite a show in store for you. Stay tuned. If you like this podcast and want more content, follow me on Twitter at vprasadmdmph. Check out the YouTube channel, Vinay Prasad, MD, MPH. Patreon backers will get access to the slides for lectures I give on Plenary Session. Want to hear from us? Email us your question at plenarysessionpodcast@gmail.com. First up, listener questions. The first listener question comes from Dr. Sophie Halliger, who is an infectious disease expert in Denmark. Sophie's a friend of the show and Plenard, and asked me to take a look at a policy forum piece that is co-authored by Didier Raoult. That's right, Didier Raoult. The man, the myth, the legend. He put hydroxychloroquine on the map. And only later did we learn that hydroxychloroquine was completely mistaken, as every single randomized trial to date finds that it is staggeringly negative and has no benefit for COVID-19. But that doesn't stop him from doubling down. First, I think in all seriousness, we should acknowledge that this gentleman did a major disservice in the middle of a pandemic. He displayed an animosity for randomized controlled trials and a propensity to hype uncontrolled, quasi-experimental data, if you'll call it that, in his 1,000-person uncontrolled study. And he promulgated and pushed the use of hydroxychloroquine and got a lot of people to use it. And in retrospect, all those people probably took something that had no benefit. And he wasted a lot of time, and he squandered the most precious resource there is in a pandemic or in any medical situation, which is people who are willing to try one thing or the other with the goal of answering what actually helps and what doesn't. Well, he's back with a new Policy Forum article, and this is entitled, and the title says it all, Why Randomized Controlled Trials Are Not Appropriate During Pandemics, by Dr. Brocchi and Didier Raoult from Marseille, France. Yes, the place where evidence went to die. Marseille, France. Let's see what they have to say. Abstract. In epidemics, there's an urgent need for new knowledge on drug efficacy to help policymakers fight the crisis. Well, that's true. That is true. Among clinical studies, RCTs are claimed to be the gold standard. However, they suffer from several limits and most of the time do not reach the aims. Yet, the best research methodology to do this is a matter of debate. Oh, is it? Is it? Well, let's see. What do they say? First of all, they begin, quote, an RCT is designed to attempt to reduce bias. Well, they got that part right. They state that RCTs reduce causality and spurious bias. I've not really heard it called causality bias, but I believe I get their point, which is that RCTs are a wonderful way of separating what is the causal effect of an intervention versus not having that intervention. That's why they're really, really useful. But their general argument is that in the midst of a pandemic, it takes a while to conduct a randomized trial and publish results. That, as we all know, when things are obviously beneficial, we don't need randomized trials. And of course, they cite a parachute paper. But guess what? They don't cite the original BMJ paper. They cite reference 3. And what is this reference 3? Oh boy, it's Bobby Ye's paper. It's the new paper where, in order to conduct a randomized control trial, they had to lower the height to 0.6 meters. So they cite that paper, which is exactly how I predicted it would be cited. It would be cited by people who don't want to do randomized trials to justify not doing them, which is the entirely foreseeable consequence of Bobby Ye's paper, which is that people would cite it in this way. So those are their general sort of thoughts, that it takes too long to do. One of their other objections they raise is that they have other sorts of problems Their other objection is that you wouldn't do it in obvious situations, and we quickly learned the pandemic was devastating, and we quickly learned that if you gave hydroxychloroquine, things were better, ergo, it's a parachute-esque intervention. I mean, I think the problems with this argument are several-fold. One, it takes too long to do. Well, it takes many people a long time to do randomized trials, particularly people who are unwilling to randomize patients. But as we saw with the recovery trial, as we saw with the French discovery and the WHO solidarity, as we saw with the remdesivir NIAID study, they are doable and they were done in a timely fashion. And the NIAID study and dexamethasone in the recovery trial, those are giving information still in the midst of a pandemic. And that information is useful. And it didn't take so long to publish the papers because they could issue a press release and they could put it on a preprint server, and when it was well done, they could have previously posted their statistical analysis plan and their protocol as the recovery investigators did, and so we would all be prepared. And people like me, the moment I saw the press release, I had read the protocol, which was already available to me. I was convinced that that was a well done study, well enough done, that you can act upon it. Similarly, I think the NIAID study was a positive study. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. They changed their endpoint, but they did so when very few events had occurred and without looking at events. And although the primary endpoint was not overall survival, it was a clinical endpoint. It wasn't a surrogate. That's a common fallacy. It was a clinical endpoint. It's just a lesser clinical endpoint. So, Didier Raoult is incorrect. And the final thing that's incorrect is that before he had time to complete his victory lap for hydroxychloroquine, many people had come to the scene with randomized trial data showing that it didn't do what he thought it did. In addition to that, it would have been done even sooner if it weren't for people like him, who took 1,000 people and did not randomize them. We would have already had randomized trial data for anticoagulants if the Mount Sinai investigators had decided to randomize instead of conducting a large, uncontrolled experiment. We would have already had the randomized trial data. So, people who say we can't do randomized trials in a pandemic, I don't think they understand the issue. If the outcome occurs in a rapid fashion, as death does, unfortunately, with COVID, if you're going to die of COVID, you're not going to die of it 5 years from acquisition, you're going to die of it in the first few weeks of getting it. The endpoint is occurring with some frequency. The case fatality rate varies based on age, but there's no doubt about it. It's occurring with a brisk frequency, particularly in people of advanced age, 15%, 20%, 25% in some series. The event is occurring quickly and in large numbers. And there are a number of things, there's no shortage of things that have putative hypotheses why they might help. In fact, there are more things that keep being dreamt up. Of course, acalabrutinib is being tested, and selinexor, of course. Who has not looked at selinexor and thought, that's a drug to try for COVID? I mean, obviously that would be a logical step. But people are trying all sorts of things. And the way to do it is a randomized controlled trial. And you can power your trial for mortality. And if you commit and accrue people with very loose inclusion criteria and do a large, simple trial like recovery, you can do it really quickly and get 11,000 people, as the UK investigators proved. So Didier Raoult is incorrect that it takes too long. Didier Raoult is also incorrect that we don't do randomized trials for hydroxychloroquine because it is a parachute. A parachute is a drug that improves survival from 99.999% to 0%, near 0%. To 1 death per 100,000 jumps or something like that. Every time I say that number, I get another email from some parachutist who says that I'm slightly off. And you know what? I don't care what the actual number is, you parachutists, because that's not the point. The point is that it's a huge effect size. It's an analogy. It's not that no one's talking about parachutes all the time. We're talking about interventions with light switch effect sizes that you don't need randomized trials for. And in fact, Didier Raoult had a way that he could have done that. If he picked people who are on ECMO and gave them hydroxychloroquine and gave 10 people that and they all survived, and then doctors in New York gave it to 10 people and they all survived and nobody died of COVID anymore that we were giving hydroxychloroquine, it would be a light switch. But it wasn't like that at all. People who were giving it had no idea if they couldn't even tell if they felt like it was making a difference. And that's the common scenario for medicines. We don't have parachutes. Parachutes don't grow on trees like pears at a pear farm. Parachutes, they're not all over the place. In biomedicine, they're few and far between. Biology's complicated. Hitting the ball out of the park is very rare. It's very rare in medicine, biomedicine. Of the millions of things we do, it's probably occurred in less than 100 cases that you have a true parachute. So, he's incorrect. And his own quasi-experimental data was not consistent with the parachute effect. So he's also wrong there. The last thing he's wrong about is this statement, quote, "All things being equal, the best external, ethically acceptable comparators are historical arms." The reason he's wrong about that is that we do have comparisons of interventions that were concluded to be beneficial based on historical controls. In other words, I give it to 50 people now and I compare it to what 50 people did 5 years ago. Those interventions appear to be positive in an astonishingly large percentage of the time, 77% in a famous paper by Sachs and colleagues. When replicated in randomized control trials, they were positive just 20% of the time. In other words, things that look good in historical controls, maybe only 1 in 4 or 1 in 3 actually do work. I think what people don't understand here is that when you are in an epidemic situation, when you're in any situation in medicine, the premium to know what actually helps is immense. When you do studies in a time-sensitive situation that don't add knowledge, you're just wasting everyone's time. You're not helping anyone. You're just wasting everyone's time. You're squandering an opportunity. If a house is on fire and the flames are picking up steam, you might say, we don't have a lot of time to do something. Before we know it, the whole house will be burned down. You could go and get some water and start hosing down the house, or call the fire department, get them, connect that fire hydrant and start hosing down the house. But that requires coordination. That requires the commitment that that's the best strategy. Or you could just stand there and blow on the house. Just blow on it. And that's what they're doing with uncontrolled studies. They're just blowing on the house and saying, we don't have time to call the fire department. Well, you know what? It might take them too long, but if you don't call them, you blowing on the house is not going to do anything. And similarly, when you do studies that just don't give you anything useful, you have no idea if you helped or hurt. You're wasting everyone's time. I guess what really baffles me is that, why am I telling a scientist who, is in his 60s, who's had a long career, why we need to do randomized trials? He didn't pick up that pearl earlier in his career. So, in short, this is a sad paper from a sad person who did a great deal of disservice. He's going to be on the top of the list. There's a big spot reserved on that list for a colossal screw up. And then around that colossal screw up, there's going to be satellite screw-ups, and that'll be Didier Raoult, and that will be the Surgisphere fiasco, and that's going to be one of the next things we talk about. So on that positive note, thank you to Sophie for this very fascinating Policy Forum article that I wholeheartedly disagree with, that cites the Robert Ye paper as I predicted it would be cited, grossly misused. See, that's what it's going to be cited for the rest of time. It'll be cited by people who don't want to do randomized trials. And that's the problem with that paper, which I think I discussed on a prior podcast. On that positive note, we'll shift to the next topic. PPIs and COVID-19. The authors are back and they have a lengthy rebuttal to some of the concerns that were raised. And of course, this was the paper where, interestingly, it had, 6, maybe 8 times the number of people taking an online survey who had COVID than Americans who actually had COVID at that time. Among people with COVID, there was an astonishingly high percent in Latinx groups, which that itself wouldn't be too surprising, except those people who had COVID, and many of them did not have beyond a high school education, and they simultaneously were in households that had over $200,000 a year in income. And the authors are back, and they're back with their rebuttal, and they've done a bunch of sensitivity analyses for people who signed up to the survey late, and those late people might have been not fully forthright in the answers, and therefore, even if we exclude them, however, we still find a dose response, so we believe the results are reliable. We also think that there are a lot of Latinx households that are multi-generational. Those households, even though some people might not have beyond a high school degree, there's somebody else in the house who's bringing a lot of sizable income, so they have a cumulative income over $200,000. There's quite a tale they've woven for why their data should still stand. But the overall conclusion that they haven't come to is that they ought to take down their paper. And then I noticed that there was a journal club about this paper, and in the journal club I saw people talking about whether or not you can really trust an odds ratio that's less than 4. And I was like, you don't need to talk about the odds ratio, you don't need to talk about colliders and confounding when the claim that's been tossed out there is that these data are not real. They are falsified, they're lies. When that's the claim that's on the table, we don't need to get into the nuances of the study. We really need a serious commitment to ask, is that true? And you don't answer, is it true? Are people lying on my survey? By doing sensitivity analyses in the set of data that you believe is compromised comparing to the set you believe is not compromised. You don't know how deep the rot is. And the only way to know how deep the rot is to get to the data itself. It's to go all the way back to the beginning and find out who were the people who filled the survey and contact them and just do a spot fact check. Here's what I'd suggest. You take 10% of the people who filled out your survey and you call them up. Or, if you have the ability, you knock on a door, you call them up. You call them up and you start to get, and then you ask a bunch of follow-up questions to try to verify if what you get is true. And if what you find is 10% or 20% of your spot check, COVID cases check, you can't verify they had COVID. You can't verify that even though they have only high school education, they are in a household with $200,000 income. If you start to get irregularities in the spot check of the data, you got to pull the whole paper. You see, the issue here is if the data is valid, you got to go to the data. You can't dance around this issue. And I guess at the end of the day, there are so many people who independently looked at this and thought, this is really not right. And they've all said it online. And I don't understand why the authors and the journal and nobody wants to really take it seriously. It's a serious claim that there is a fundamental rot in the data set. It's a claim that requires adjudication. I mean, I'm trying to think of an analogy. If you discovered that there's a lab researcher who committed a spectacular fraud, then somebody might say, boy, this person published 4 papers in this other person's lab 2 years ago. We got to go back and double check. And they'll go back to the notebooks and say, like, do we have notebooks? Do we really have original Western blots here? Is there any potential for photoshopping? And then they might say, you know what? This is really kind of, this person, something happened. We'd just be better off replicating these experiments. Let's get another postdoc to do it. I mean, that's the kind of stuff that people do all the time when there are these kinds of big claims being made that the rot could be potentially deep. That's the sort of honest way to deal with it. I think the not appropriate way to deal with it is the way these authors are dealing with it. It's embarrassing a little bit to not have noticed that there's some weird things in the data set and to not have raised that and try to flesh that out beforehand. When you go get a new online company doing an online survey that's paying people. The other issue is that there's a really nice thread that somebody put about how she, as a postdoctoral scientist, had a survey that the bots invaded, and bots invading surveys, especially surveys that pay money, that's a thing. That's a common thing that these bots are completing surveys inaccurately in the hopes of gaining money or gaming the system. With all that going on, I think that the burden of proof has to be held by the authors to prove that these data are valid. Let's say even hypothetically, you had a perfect data set. You really know who got COVID, who didn't get COVID, nationally representative sample, PCR proven COVID. Trying to link a medication with COVID is still a very slippery problem. And I'm happy to discuss all the sort of epidemiologic concerns there, but I refuse to discuss it for this paper that hasn't even cleared the I'm not sure if the data are real part. And, I think that them having that sort of journal club just gives a false legitimacy to the idea that this is a paper that we can discuss like any other paper. It's not. It's a paper that a number of people have said, we are not sure your data are truthful. And they have an obligation to prove the data are right. And that means going all the way back to the people who are filling out the survey and verifying it at that level. It's not sensitivity analyses after the fact with a potentially flawed data set where you don't know how deep the rot is. That's not sufficient. And I found their rebuttal to be not sufficient. And, when they start to conjure up stories that, well, it's possible that they're multi-generation households and somebody else has a lot of income, even though the person, and it's not even wealth, it's income. Somebody else in the household has income of $200,000, even though the person who's filling out the survey doesn't have a high school degree. When they start to conjure up that kind of story, you know that somebody's like not being a straight shooter, because the most likely explanation is that people are bullshitting on a form. That's the most likely explanation. It still is. You need to prove it's not the case. Until you prove it's not the case, withdraw your paper. As somebody pointed out that, it says something that when you somehow feel like you miss the good old days of Surgisphere, where in a short period of time, the authors retracted their paper in the good old days of Surgisphere. Now that doesn't happen like it used to. So on that positive note, we'll turn to the third listener question. All right. This question is by Ken Noguchi, who is a friend of the show. I think he's a plenard. I'm going to say he's a plenard, and if Ken disagrees, he'll have to tweet, I'm not a plenard. But Ken writes, at plenary session, question for the pod. What keeps you in academic medicine research despite all the negatives that you highlight on the podcast? Listening to your podcast makes me less enthusiastic and more cynical towards pursuing research, and I'm not sure that's the right response. Ken, oh boy, that's a good question. I was just telling some of my friends that I was going to do this podcast later, and I have to answer this question because I said I would answer it. They're like, well, what are you going to say? And I was like, well, I guess I have to tell the truth. Insofar as one can tell the truth, but I guess I'll try to be as honest as I can, because, what else do people listen to this podcast for? Okay, so it's a good question. I guess I would say a few things to be very clear. I mean, one, why am I negative about academic medicine? I think that, as listeners know, that, it's a place that, is astonishingly non-academic in the sense that there are many people who have successful careers who trainees seek to emulate, who aren't really academics. They don't really understand how data is generated and interpreted and how conclusions should be drawn from that data. They aren't really committed to that process. They like the trappings. They like giving lectures and repeating talking points that other people repeat, and participating in studies where mostly you see patients on a trial and then the medical writer helps write it for you and the statistician helps analyze it for you, and you get the slides that the company helps make for you when you give the oral session, and then people start to praise you and give you the CME events that themselves are sponsored by the company, and you get the consulting opportunity where you can go and tell the company something that they already know and that's no surprise to anybody, and you get to say what they want to hear and vice versa. They fall into that sort of trapping, and that's a huge thing in oncology. I also think that people who really care about teaching trainees, who care about trying to teach students, I don't want to say they're thwarted, but they're certainly not rewarded in most of my experience. So I guess maybe it might be useful to try to answer this question in two moments in time. The first moment was when I was coming out of fellowship and I took my first faculty position at OHSU, where I was for 3 years up until, really just a few weeks ago. And I really, haven't been in my new position long enough to even have a sense, especially with all the sort of things going on right now. So I have no sense of what it will be like going forward, but there's some things that keep me optimistic, which I'll come to at the end. But when I finished my fellowship and I took my first position, I guess, to be honest, like a lot of people, I mean, I didn't really know a lot about anything other than academic medicine. I trained at the NCI, the National Cancer Institute. That was my terminal training program. We have roughly 10 to 13 fellows a year, and where they go is roughly maybe one goes for pharma, one goes to the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, maybe half stay at NIH, maybe on a typical season for further training or to join one of the teams there. And then the other half go into academic medicine. Maybe one every other year goes into private practice or something like that. They're very few. And I guess so my knowledge of private practice was limited. My understanding of the salaries, how the incentives are structured, what exactly they do was deeply limited. I knew a lot about what people in the academy do. And I guess I would say that even though I had some elements of cynicism, I had the good fortune of always being connected with some physicians in academic medicine who I really, really liked. Obviously, at University of Chicago, I spent a good deal of time chasing after Adam Seafu to pick his brain. And he's someone I still admire who is in an academic setting and manages to resist all of the things I think are corrosive and manages to do all of the things I applaud. He's a consummate clinician, a great teacher, really thoughtful scholar and deep thinker, and somebody who I really like working with and writing with because I think he's really thoughtful. And so, he was a great role model. And so I said, maybe I could stay in the academy and be like Adam. The other persons I think of, at Northwestern, when I trained, there were just really many faculty, gentleman, H.D. Munchie, who's just a fantastic HemeOnc doctor, Dave Neely, Robert Hirschsteck, who writes the wonderful stuff for Peace of My Mind column. I mean, these are all academics who I, still admire, who have a really nice balance, who have never fallen prey to any of the sort of problems I lay out on this podcast. There are certainly many others who I'm forgetting in both those places. And then I moved to the NCI, where there's a larger-than-life presence of Tito Fojo, who was the program director, who was, one of the first people to hit on the cost of cancer drug problem, who is hyper knowledgeable and critical about every cancer drug study. I'd like to say that Tito is like, if Tito had a podcast, if that were something that he'd want to do, it would be like Plenary Session. But in addition to all of the statistical thinking about the trial itself, he'll tell you everything about the molecular development of a drug. He'll tell you what were the preclinical studies, why that led to advancement, why he wouldn't have taken the compound forward. He would have brought all that pharmacology into it, pharmacodynamics, pharmacokinetics. He'd bring all the basic science in because he's a card-carrying laboratory scientist. And those are the kind of lectures he gave us. And so for me, Tito and Susan Bates, who ran a team at the NCI, were really two people who I greatly admired. And I thought, really were, again, avoiding all the sorts of pitfalls I describe on this podcast. So I guess part of the reason I made the jump to stay in academics was I didn't know any world outside of the academy. And I had been blessed that at every stage of my training, I always had a role model who I felt like I, was a 100% supporter of. So then I moved to my first faculty position. And, when you are finally faculty, I think you start to learn more than you knew before. You start to understand how much they pay faculty and how much they don't, and what are the things that drive pay and incentives at the institution. And, I can't speak for every place, but, for the experience I had was that, clinical revenue, clinical volumes drive the majority of even academic oncology salaries. That no one, to my knowledge, is really incentivized to write thoughtful papers or anything like that. They're incentivized to see more patients in clinic. And if anyone works in an academic practice that's different, I mean, the only other difference I had was at NCI, where NCI is truly a place where there is no, there's no sort of incentives at all. The incentive is to really do good science, and you're given a lot of free time and opportunities. It's a different sort of system, a governmental system. But it might, to some degree, suffer from the opposite problem, which is that in a place where there are no real incentives, that it might suffer from the problem that because there are few incentives, that a lot of people can linger for a great deal of time rather unproductively and not really get any push to push them to do something or to make some space for some junior colleague. So that may be one of the pitfalls of such a system. So my experience was that the Academy had, a unique set of interests. More than, of course, the place I was at. I saw that the hottest commodity in the oncology market was somebody who had a lot of connections with industry. And every institution is always trying to recruit a head of GI, a head of GU, a head of whatever. And they want somebody who knows all the drug companies to work with and bring them trials. And those trials have massive overhead, so you can one, often be profitable from the trials itself, but two, you have that great sort of market advantage of why is somebody going to go to your center and not the local community doctor, because you have trials that they don't have, and you can kind of play that game of whether or not those trials are really better, but maybe we could advertise as if they are. So that was the sort of impression I got. And then the other thing that I learned with some more experience was that, at least in oncology, I felt that as that the incentive to be a good teacher, a good mentor to people, which is something that I care about, that is non-existent. And so, you mentor, I don't even know the number, but somebody could look it up on my website, how many people who I've co-authored papers with who were trainees who came to me looking for a project. I'm sure it's the majority of the papers I've written. And I taught classes, and, all of that was really sort of unrewarded work by the institution. I had no clinical time to do that. There's no FTE allocated to teach my class. I did that like the way you might go to spin class after work. That's your hobby. My hobby was, in the month of January, I taught appraisal of clinical literature class. And so I guess one of the things that I think further concerned me about academic medicine was that this is a place that ought to have a commitment to teaching, and it appears that the incentives are not structured in that way at all. It's a commitment to generating low credibility trials and putting people on low credibility trials. That's the commitment. That's where the money moves. And the commitment to teaching and being critical of trials and critical of paradigms and critical of things, to using one's noggin, that is not represented in terms of how money flows through the system. It's not incentivized. And so that gave me a deep cynicism, Ken. So I share your cynical take. So where did I go from there? And then I guess the next jump. I suppose I had come to the conclusion that I would be interested in knowing what other positions are out there. And this time, unlike the first time, I did apply very broadly to private practice jobs, many private practice jobs. I think statistically more private practice jobs than academic jobs, and then a few academic jobs. I was excited about, and I am excited about, the position that I now hold because of a few advantages. I'm in epidemiology biostatistics. I'm at an institution that my survey of every single person I've talked to has revealed to me that there is a huge commitment to education. And I do see that there are people all around me right now who take a lot of pride in the classes they teach and the job they're doing in terms of teaching and conveying information. They take a great deal of pride at it, and they are rewarded for it, and they are given time and space to do that. And so that is something that I think is a huge positive that I'm excited to learn more about. And I hope to participate in all those things, because that's something that, doing this podcast is sort of a spin-off of the way I like to teach. It's obviously not teaching. It's not interactive as it ought to be. And it's not as much, and I don't learn as much because people don't push me as much as in the class, but it gets at the same thing. But at the same time, I also applied to a number of private jobs. And what did I know this time? So now finally, after a few years, you get wiser. You learn, as a senior faculty member once told me at the NCI, that your first job is a 5-year job because you don't really understand how things work. And so, I started to look, and I'll tell you, there's a lot I liked about it. lot I liked about private practice. It was, there's certainly many practices that really do deliver, I think, good patient care. That there are busy doctors. They have a lot of patients to see, and they really want to do high value things. They don't want to do things that are marginal or frivolous. They want to have good conversations. They want to do the right thing. And so I was really impressed. And in the United States, there's a huge pay differential, often like massive. And so that, as somebody who comes from a house with not a lot of money growing up, that is something that is motivating. And I guess I would say that the final thing came to it probably was much closer than people think. I mean, my ideal position is if I could do patient care for a good chunk of my time, but also having some small amount of time to do some of these other things I think are interesting, like some of the research projects I do, which are all meta research, which I'm kind of curious to do, and some of the stuff I do here on the podcast, which I do find interesting to some degree. So if I could preserve like a day and a half, 2 days to do that kind of stuff, then I'd be really comfortable jumping into one of those jobs. And I guess, to be perfectly honest, I think there was one position that I was really close to taking. Really wonderful practice, great colleagues, really sharp oncologists, did broad HemeOnc. And again, so that's one thing that's different in academics. You often don't do broad HemeOnc, but in private practice you do. But, listeners of this podcast might get the sense that I like doing broad HemeOnc. I like it all, from benign heme to that. I mean, I do think that's quite interesting, and so I have no objection to doing that. In fact, I probably prefer it. So that was enticing about this. The compensation was really deeply enticing, amazing. The colleagues were great. It was really well-run practice. It runs like amazingly well. It's not clunky like many systems can be in the academy. It runs like super, super smooth. So the one position that I looked at was geographically in a place that I wasn't ready to go to. That was the bottom line. It was geographically in a place I wasn't ready to go to. I thought I could live a ways away and commute, but that was kind of struck down. And so that kind of led to going away from that position. The other one was geographically exactly where I wanted it to be. Had really sort of maybe not as perfect as that other practice, but another private group that was really kind of a sweet spot. Maybe there would be a little time for me to do some of these other things I like to do. And I was really interested in it. And it was geographically, in a very acceptable place. But never came through. And so then I got this terrific offer here, which, at a place that I felt like had a different philosophy about teaching, real commitment to supporting that, as well as sort of just a track record of really stellar, top-notch epidemiology and biostatistics, which were kind of parts of, a huge chunk of what I care about and what I do that is often underrepresented in pure oncology divisions. And so I said, it's worth a shot, and so far I've had, I've only been a few weeks in, but it has really felt like a terrific call, that I guess I'm getting to do a lot of what I want to do. And I'm getting the sense that people are very positive about the work they do, and they really care about it. So that is kind of a long answer to your question, which is what keeps me here. I guess the answer is also the simple truth is that, I hope my career is not over yet. I'm literally only 5 years into the job. But that feels different depending on where you are. I was recently, when I was in medical school, there was a faculty member who I thought was a really sharp person, and I looked up where this person is recently, and this person has moved on to a new job. This was somebody who, when I was a student, I always admired and looked up to, even though this person has a totally different field and nothing to do with anything I do. But I always admired this person. I admired the way this person carried themselves, and I admired this person for this person's commitment to medical students and taking that time to talk to us a little bit more than the average person. And I looked up this person. They were senior person at a different university now. And I looked back and I saw that when this person was, supervising me as a medical student, this person was only 5 years out of training, out of residency. And I remember thinking, that I thought of this person as a very senior person. This is a senior person, but they're only 5 years out of residency. I'm only 5 years out of fellowship. And so I think one's perspective of that changes a great deal, because now I view myself as a junior person because I'm only 5 years out of fellowship. But in fact, others may view me as a senior person, much as I view this person as a senior person. So I guess that's the thing about getting older. You don't see it coming, but it happens. So I guess my point with that is that, careers are long, they're 30 years. And I think that there's plenty of time where, who knows what the future will bring. I think that the real bonuses to the academy are you get to work with really sharp young people who often challenge you and get you thinking better. That's one. Two, they often come and help work on projects with you, and they do a better job than you could do, and they bring more to that than you can do. Those are really the pluses. Three, even though all of the interests, the incentives are ruinous, I think overall, really ruinous, there have always people who create pockets that buck those incentives. Adam, the people I mentioned a minute ago were all people who've found a place in the academy doing what they want to doing and never compromising and not being part of all those sort of forces that we don't like, doing bad science just to get grants and all those things. These people don't participate in that. And so there are always a few people you can look up to and still aspire for. And hopefully you find yourself, in a place where people at least have some commitment to those sorts of things, which is wanting to teach people and really get them thinking, even if they don't always agree with you, at least kind of push their thoughts, wanting to question what we're doing and ask why, and to teach that. And so I think that those are the reasons to stay. The downsides are many. No doubt about it, particularly if you are, like me, a specialist, who actually really does enjoy practicing HemeOnc broadly, and, somebody who didn't grow up with a lot, then the financial trade-offs are really large. And so I guess I would say that in my own sort of life, I think like a lot of people, my first job was really inertia. I didn't know anything. I didn't understand anything about how money flows through hospitals and divisions and why people do what they do. I think the moment, you start your first job, if you want to really understand what's going on, whether it's private practice or academics, the moment you understand how money moves through, what makes people more money, you'll understand everything. Everyone's behavior, what they're doing, the reason people double book clinics and the reason people avoid seeing patients, it's all linked to the way in which the incentives are in that space. I mean, I've almost never seen any counterexample to that. The way in which the current is flowing is all driven by the incentives. And so the moment you sort of understand the incentives, you really get to see the lay of the land. And so that was my first thing. I knew nothing, and thus I stayed in the academy. I had people in my life who I did admire, and so I thought maybe I could carve such a space. But then my second move really was much more of a nail biter. I think it much more of a really were it not for just a tip of fate. I mean, if that really sort of really wonderful practice had just geographically been a little bit different or a little bit more permissive for me commuting, if another option that wasn't geographically in the right spot had just come through a little bit sooner, if timing had been a little bit different, it so easily could have been different, and I so easily could have been outside of the academy. I think it's also worth pointing out that all of the research I do, as nice as it is to be in the academy, it doesn't require a lab, it doesn't require bench space, it doesn't require a lot of equipment. It's really a computer and that sort of stuff. And so it can really be done in a lot of spaces. All right, Ken Plenary, I don't know if that answers your question, but it's as close as I think I can get. So on that positive note, we're going to turn to our interview with Bishal Gyawali. Okay, I'm back on plenary session, joined via Zoom by Dr. Bishal Gyawali. Bishal, it's great to see you again.
It's so nice to see you. It has been a while.
It's been a while, but you're back here to talk about some recent work. But before we get into that, we were just chatting before we came along about Twitter. And, I noticed you had you had an interesting tweet. Here's your tweet from a couple days ago. There are 3 types of experts on med Twitter: fear-mongering experts, virtue signaling experts, and patting oneself on the back experts. So,
Don't you think that's an accurate description?
oh yes, you know how they say retweet isn't endorsement, but in this case, my retweet was endorsement. Oh yeah, that's that's so accurate. So I wonder if you unpack it a little bit. So, what do you mean by fear-mongering? Let's talk about that.
Yeah, first a disclaimer that I'm not an expert. So yeah, I have been seeing lately that Twitter has changed a lot since I first joined.
Yeah.
I guess I joined in the fall of 2015.
Yeah.
And in these 5 years, there has been an increase in the number of academics or physicians who have joined Twitter, and that's a good thing. It helps to put forward the debate, and it helps to bring a lot of different issues into the public and helps public discussion. But recently, the whole reason I was interested in joining Twitter in the first place was because I thought I could follow the experts, quote unquote experts.
Yeah.
And I would learn from their tweets. They would put something very thought provoking. They would put out something that would inspire me for my next project, or that would inspire me to think differently.
Yeah.
But nowadays it seems like I can just predict what the next person is going to tweet next.
Yeah.
And it's not thought provoking at all. And as I mentioned, some of the experts are purely fear-mongering experts.
Yes.
So they're going to tell all the bleak stories and all the pessimistic things that can happen. And as an audience, it would feel like, you're doomed. Like there is no hope in life. And, if you are healthy, that means you are just waiting for the diagnosis of a disease and you are going to die. If you already have disease, then you're already in a bad place. So, it's one thing to persuade people about any intervention that you think is a good intervention. And you can do that with evidence.
Yeah.
And you can convince very well with the evidence. And sometimes, you might not have a good evidence, but the risk-benefit trade-off might favor doing the intervention just to be on the safe side.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Let's talk about this pandemic.
Yeah.
And let's talk about some of the interventions that we have been doing for controlling the pandemic.
Yeah.
Lockdown or face mask and things like that. And okay, the evidence might not be strong, but you would rather do something or on the side of doing rather than not doing it.
Sure.
And you could tell that.
You could just say that. Just say that.
Yeah.
Just say that. That's fine. Yeah, I know. Why is that so hard to say? Just say that. Don't make up bullshit all the time. It's unbelievable.
Yeah. And people would gladly accept that. And then people would have no confusion about, 2 months ago you said this thing and now why are you changing your stance? I don't see any new paper coming out about this. But if you clearly said upfront that these are the risks, these are the potential benefits, and it's better to or on the side of doing this and reduce the harms rather than not doing anything. And people would be absolutely fine with that, I think.
But people like honesty, but I'll give you one example of your fear mongering. I saw somebody say something like, for all of the politicians who are thinking about opening schools, how many children are you willing to bury in graves and put in body bags before you open? And I was like, oh my God. And I was like, first of all, that's not a helpful thing to say. That's a very ignorant and foolish thing to say, because let me tell you something. In the best of times, when you open schools, there are going to be some people who pass away in automobile accidents on the way to school. That's a risk of schools. But of course, there are benefits of schools as well. Yeah. Having schools is always risks and benefits. You want to be perfectly safe, you can sit in your house, wrap yourself in bubble wrap and not do anything. Okay, now the question is, opening schools. It's a very difficult question. I don't even think I know the answer. That's what I tweeted the other day, is that I at least want to have the humility to admit that I don't even have the tool set to answer the question, because I'm just a doctor, oncologist, drug policy. But to answer this question, you have to be a psychologist to know how children develop and grow. You have to be a sociologist. You have to be a historian. You have to be an infectious disease expert. You have to be an economist. You have to be a politician. You have to be a public policy expert. You have to be, you have to have all these experts brought in, and to bring in your expert and your your way of thinking? What are the trade-offs? What are the unanticipated consequences? What does it mean for the children's success, their longevity? The risk to children, it's still, honestly, it's on the low side. The real risk is probably the transmission to parents and other people who take care of the kids.
You could accept the trade-off. You could say that, there are potential downsides. There are a lot of downsides to not opening schools, right?
Yes.
And that's why we open schools every year.
Exactly. Yes, exactly. Yeah.
But this year, things are different because of the pandemic. So you could say these are the real downsides to not opening a school that we really acknowledge. Like, especially in US, there are so many people, there are so many children who will not even get food if they don't go to school.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
So you could say these are the potential downsides, and we totally acknowledge this. But at this time, maybe the risks outweigh the benefits of opening the school. So maybe we should postpone it for a month or so. But you can't just say that people who want to open the schools are just willing to kill children. That's a very that reminds me of the way people would put up the debate about screening, cancer screening, before the pandemic times good times when we would debate about cancer screening.
Those good times. Yeah, they would say that if you don't support screening, you just want these people to die. Yeah. You just want them. You want them to die. Not just you're killing them. You want them to die. And they say, well, you know what? You don't have all-cause mortality benefit. They don't want to get into that. They just want to say you're ill-motivated. Yeah, it reminds me of that. But I think it's different in the sense that, screening, I do think one person can be knowledgeable about it to reach a conclusion. Screening, you and I can read the papers. We're doctors. We understand epidemiology. We can read the papers. We can take it all in. But schools is even more than screening, because schools is not just the sort of the prosperity of children, their social well-being, their physical well-being, their mental well-being, and it has impacts on different races and wealths in different ways. Minority children are going to be hurt the most. People whose parents don't have as much money and not well connected. I think it's just so much. And then for a doctor to go on Twitter and just blithely say, how many dead children do you want? What that is disgusting to me. I mean, that's not using your brain.
Opening schools is not an intervention at the individual level. It's not like shared decision making. Right?
Exactly.
It's a public health intervention that affects millions of people. And for making any decision like that, I mean, we are not in that role of decision making.
Exactly.
But, to put out any definitive statements like that, we should consider what other people might be facing. Like, I might be rich and I might afford private tuition for my children, and I could still go to work and someone will come and take care of my children, and I have enough money to pay for that. But there are so many people who right now, my wife is not working because my daughter's daycare got closed. So my wife needs to take care of my daughter. But there might be so many people out there who for whom the only way they can go to work might be sending their kids to school.
Exactly.
And if the kids don't go to school, someone needs to be home and take care of it. I mean, there is no answer here. I don't know what the correct answer is, but at least we have to acknowledge that there are people with different characteristics and different groups of people when we are making such a public health intervention that affects so many people at the same time. And I think I don't have the confidence to make any definitive statements regarding this.
Now, let's talk about the next part, virtue signaling. You said that there are virtue signaling experts. These are the experts who are good at telling you all the things they did that, really, preach to the choir, appeal to the base. What do you mean by the virtue signaling experts?
You are going to get me into hot waters. The second group of experts on my Twitter, you'll see it's as you perfectly described, people who are preaching to the choir, and I guess it also connects with what we just discussed, that we are not acknowledging things from the perspective of other people, and we are just trying to promote what we think is a good idea or a good action. It may or may not be backed by evidence, but we are just trying to show people how other people should be acting based on how you are acting. Right. And you are trying to put yourself as an example of how everybody should be like, or how everybody should think like, or how everybody should act like. And if one really wants to dig into those particular statements, then people will find that those are actually empty statements. They are not backed by science. They are not backed by evidence. And it's just empty virtue signaling. And I guess that's, I guess a lot of mid-Twitter has degraded into feeling glorified about how many followers you have.
Yeah.
And the whole point in every tweet from most of the experts, I don't want to say all the experts, but most of the experts is about how this tweet will create lots of likes and retweets, and they will clap for me, and I'll increase my followers, and I'll be looked upon by the society as someone who said such great things. I don't know whether that is actually helping the debate or just helping people to get more and more polarized about issues.
Yeah, that's what I came to the conclusion of, is that it's really polarized. I'll give you another example. There was the doctor who, I don't know who this poor gentleman is, but there's an unfortunate story of a gentleman, and I don't even know if it's true or not, but based on what was posted, it was a gentleman who is from, I think, a southern red state, and he had a number of tweets where he said that masks are stupid, or masks are an infringement of his liberties, and that he doesn't want to wear masks. And then later he may have had some posts on social media saying that he had a cough, felt a little unwell. Then he had later...
Oh, yeah, I remember seeing that.
Yeah, then he had some posts saying that he was getting worse, fevering, went to the hospital. And then somebody found that there was an obituary published for this gentleman, so he passed away. Yeah. And it seems like...
It was unfortunate.
Yeah, it's very sad. Okay, it's very sad. And he's a young man. My goodness, the guy was like less than 40, and he has children, a family, parents. It's a horrible tragedy. So then some virtue signaling doctor comes along and tweets this, tweets this story, and says, look at this guy. This is what happens when you don't wear masks. And I found that to be just so despicable. I mean, can you imagine? There are many things in life, many outcomes that may be influenced by your behavior. Maybe not. Maybe he could have done all those things. He could have lived in Seattle, a liberal place. He could have worn the mask. He could have been raised in a different culture where he voted for different people, and he was a liberal, and he believed in the masks, and he wore the mask. He still might have died, right? That might not have been a germane event. Maybe it changed. What was the probability change his outcome? Who knows? But there are other things we do like that. Like smoking, was the example I raised. And the smoking example was to show that there would be no doctor is so indecent that they would post the picture of somebody who passed away of lung cancer and said, well, and then a picture of them smoking and said, well, this is what happens when you smoke. That would be so crass, so despicable, so antithetical to the oath we take as physicians. And yet, in this time of COVID, people think it's acceptable to shame this young man who passed away for his statements on masks, which may or may not have contributed to his death and honestly are not really relevant. This is a human being who died. You shouldn't talk about him at all unless you want to say something nice. That was what I was raised how to speak about people who passed away.
I was also very saddened when I saw that. If it was something else, then people would be out there saying, this is just an association. This does not mean causation.
Yeah.
And, things like that. Like if something exactly opposite had happened, right? A person who always put on face masks, never got out of the house, but still caught the disease and unfortunately passed away. And if some these pseudoscience groups posted a story like that, this is a man who never got out, who washed his hands, put on mask, but still he got COVID and died. If a pseudoscience group put out something like that, we'd be jumping to bash that person, and we would say, see, this is not causation. You just
you're
absorb
right. Yes.
something, event.
If it went the other way, you would quickly say that doesn't prove it. Right. Yeah.
Yeah. But here, like using that story to, in fact, shame the person, and the identity of the person is known.
Yes. If they show his face and his name, it's yeah.
And then like that person has a family.
Yeah.
And then you're publicly telling this person, in a way, you are telling that he deserves to die, right?
Yeah.
Which is so unbecoming of a physician or an academics or any human being. To be honest.
Any human being.
I found that really, really sad. And that's the reason you don't see me tweeting as often these days in COVID era as I used to in pre-COVID days. You know, like in pre-COVID days, I used to tweet about all the oncology studies, and I used to tell this study is not good, this study is good, and I used to tweet a lot. But in COVID days, I'm kind of disappointed with Twitter community as a whole. So I try to still stick to like oncology tweets. But even then, like I can't get away with what I see in my home feed. Everybody tweeting about COVID with the level of confidence that they have in their statements and making those accusations for people who are not following that. I'm actually disappointed with our community as a whole.
Yeah. Well, here's my theory of what's going on. Because like you, I joined, I think, 2014, 2015-ish, and I've been on for 5 years. So we've been on for the same period of time. When we started, the people who are, first of all, there was no med Twitter hashtag or whatever that we didn't have, people didn't have that, but doctors found each other and we were talking about academic medical issues. And, there were some good discussions. I remember, very vigorous discussions on cost of cancer drugs, drug approval standards that actually did get people of different points of view to comment about that. And it was, maybe we didn't all change our minds, but it was something interesting for the audience, I think. What I think
it did give you a lot of good research ideas.
Oh, it
like conflicts of interest disclosure on Twitter and things like that.
It gave me a lot of research ideas. Yeah, it did. It gave me a lot of research ideas. Conflicts of interest. Every time they said something about surrogate speed drug approval, that was a paper. It gave me a lot of research ideas. Do doctors tweet more about drug company costs than about hospital costs? That Craig Garthwaite wrote. I did a paper and okay, so it gave me a lot of ideas. So here's how it shifts. And this is, it shifted because more and more people joined. And the people who joined took something that was more about technical issues within the field and made it more politics. See, politics is something different than medicine. In medicine, if you want to have an opinion on Ramucirumab, well, you can't just have an opinion. You have to read. There are at least 6 FDA-approved indications, you're going to tell me in a minute, for Ramucirumab. They're randomized controlled trials. They have controlled arms. They have certain primary endpoints. They have certain magnitude of benefit. You need to know all that to have an opinion on Ramucirumab. To have an opinion on whether or not Trump is good or bad, anyone can have that opinion. They watch TV once, he's bad, he's good. You instantly fall into that camp. And people on med Twitter are, we have to admit, they are vigorously anti-Trump. They're on the left, political left. To be honest, I'm also on the political left too. I mean, that's where I fall politically. But they're on the political left. They're on the ideological end of the spectrum, probably pretty far out on the left. They have, I think, very strong democratic left beliefs. They're a lot more.
But I mean, now that we are talking about politics, it's bizarre that people can't imagine that someone could be anti-Trump, but let's say pro-school opening, for example.
Yes, exactly. Yes,
how can how can those? I'm not saying I'm pro or anti anything, but what baffles me is how can those things be mutually exclusive?
Yes, you know what it is? It's that some of the people who are anti-school reopening may only be anti-reopening just to stick a finger in Trump's eye. But just because he's Trump and just because you don't like him doesn't mean everything he does is wrong. I mean, maybe even a broken watch is right twice a day. Maybe he's right. Okay.
I guess the better example is from hydroxychloroquine, right?
Yes, exactly.
People wanted hydroxychloroquine to fail.
Yeah, they wanted it. And you know what? They almost sabotaged the trials because their rhetoric was, if you take hydroxychloroquine once, you'll have VT and die. You'll have VT and die. It was ridiculous. So, I mean, that's how polarizing he is, that people take more extreme views on, hydroxychloroquine, a great example. But what I want to say is that, so I've noticed this has been creeping in. Politics has been creeping in. And many of the people who you have pointed out as virtue signaling, fear-mongering. They talk mostly politics. They're not talking medicine. In fact, I say that I can barely find medicine in my feed. It's all politics. And it's politics from people who aren't don't study political theory. They're just like every doctor at a dinner party. A doctor at a dinner party, the stereotype is they have an opinion on everything. They think they know everything, even though it's outside of their scope of expertise. And you have all these people on Twitter. And Bishal, it fits with, soft targetism. It fits with the politics, which is that it's so easy to have an opinion on these issues. You don't have to educate yourself. You don't have to read. It takes no mental energy, and you can be passionate and angry, and you can find your group of people and they can support you. And then you go on Med Twitter, and everything you do is trying to poke a finger in the eye of this guy that many people don't like. And people who are doctors who are on the right on issues, maybe not even the far right, but just slightly center right. Those people on Twitter, they're going to get mauled. They're going to get, they're going to get the mobs chew them up if they start saying things like schools. There are trade-offs involved. We need to consider those. They're going to get attacked. Shutdowns have trade-offs, or masks may have unintended consequences. And they're going to get attacked. Or to even suggest that the economy has something to do with human health, they're going to get attacked. So it's become, and like you, I think I would say, I don't know if I tweet less or not. I think I do when I looked at the stats recently, but I certainly look at it less. I used to look at it and enjoy looking at it. Now I don't look for days. I don't look at the damn website. Sometimes I have an idea, I tweet it, and then I just go in, tweet it, and then let it go. I don't even look to see what these people say.
But they not only tweet about politics. Once in a while, they do tweet about medicine. That's when a new drug gets approved. Then they want to congratulate everyone. They want to congratulate everyone. They even do not look at the evidence. They just say this is a great day for our patients. Congratulations to everyone involved in this. And whenever some big name publishes a big paper in New England Journal, they just want to be in the good books, and they just want to say, congratulations to this amazing team. I don't know, maybe they're hoping to be a co-author in the next paper. I don't know.
I think what it is, part of it is that, it's maybe a mid-career or junior career faculty who was willing to be the first or last author on a drug company-sponsored study. And now the drug that they worked on, the paper that they published, has become an accepted FDA approval. So for your career, that's good. And so people are saying, congratulations, you got olaparib approved in pancreas cancer with germline BRCA mutations. Great for you. And it's like, well, too bad that's not great for patients, because we had to give a sugar pill control arm instead of continuing FOLFIRINOX. And this drug is probably worse than that. Nobody cares. I think it's like, that's what disappoints me, is that these are people who the first thing a trialist should care about is, are the results of my study going to make life better for people with this disease? Not, are the results of my study going to get me a JCO paper and get me a plenary session? But they have forgotten that. That has been completely forgotten. And all they care about is their career. They don't even ask the question, what's best for patients? And that's why the only reason this podcast has any popularity in some quarters is that we're one of the few places where we actually try to say what's best for patients. And I know you try to do that in your writing.
Yeah. And I guess that's why my career is not flying. I always keep shooting on my own foot.
I know. That's why I was like, I know. That's why, as you know, I take a lot of behind closed doors. I take a lot of punishment for my views. No, I guess not only do I get so disheartened about COVID, here's another example, that PPI paper, this came out.
Oh my God. Yeah.
Okay. So did you see their response?
The biggest thing that saddens me is when big people in positions of power, editor-in-chief of big journals, they can't even accept that they did research in good faith, but it turns out that maybe the participants cheated.
Yeah, maybe they cheated. Yeah.
And so why is it so difficult for people who are already in a position of power? Yeah. It will be difficult for people like me, in fact, because it can ruin my career. I'm an early researcher, and it turns out that my research was flawed, then I'll be pretty disheartened, right? But these are people who are already at the peak of their career. They are editors-in-chief of one of the topmost journals. And the journals are supposed to teach all of us about ethical research practice, what you should be doing, what you should not be doing, what constitutes an error, and things like that. And those very people, instead of accepting the criticisms that come from social media, first they ask you to write a letter to the editor instead of.
Oh yeah, don't tweet your concerns. Write a letter to the editor. Yeah. But you are the editor. You are the editor.
That is hilarious. That should be the best joke on Twitter ever. The editor-in-chief himself tells, write a letter to the editor.
Yeah, but they're back now with their response, and their response is basically, we understand why some people out there think that a sizable portion of our data set is fraudulent. And that's because the data set found that Latinx families Latinx participants that did not have even a high school education lived in households where the median income was over $200,000 a year, and they had COVID in really record numbers. We're here to perform a series of sensitivity analyses while we think these results don't disqualify the entire paper. And so the response is this long article trying to justify why their paper shouldn't be retracted. But the easiest thing to do is, one, pick some handful, 10% of the participants, and go check. Do they really have COVID, and did they really have this household income? Just verify the fact. They don't want to do that. And they don't want to consider that the most likely explanation is not. They offer that it's most likely due to the fact that people are living in multi-generational households, even though they themselves don't have a high school degree, and somebody else in the household is making $200,000 a year, and that person and they have COVID, and they're also willing to fill out the survey. So these are all the things that they're hoping are true. Yeah. The most likely explanation is that people are lying on the form. That's still the most likely explanation. And you have not interrogated that. To interrogate that, you have to go check to see, did some of these people, are they being honest? And they don't want to do that. And you're right. These are people whose careers are well set. And you know what? I'll go even further, Bishal. They don't need to do this paper. This was I'm going to watch. Yeah, right, I'm not going to say exactly this was not an important research question. I'm sorry. No, I mean, it might be an important question, which is whether or not the widespread use of PPI predisposed people to getting COVID. But unfortunately, this method for answering the question is not going to be the reliable way to answer it. And so sometimes there are questions out there that you really are going to struggle to answer. You could ask that question for everything. Do ACE inhibitors make you more likely to get COVID? Does PPIs make you more likely to get hydroxychloroquine, hydrochlorothiazide? I mean, every drug you could possibly take, you could ask, does it affect COVID? But you have to think of rigorous ways to ask the question, or you're going to just find a sea of false positive results. And they don't have a rigorous way. Anyway.
The biggest problem is, with this particular study, it's not just like a study that you just read and say, oh, it's flawed and you leave. Like, this has real consequences.
Yes, right.
This has a big headline saying, like, patients are afraid. They are taking PPI for a long time, for GERD or whatever. And now they're scared that they are going to catch COVID. So this paper has real consequences. And when you know that your paper is going to have real consequences on real patients in a scale of millions all over the world, then you have to be extra careful.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I feel so conflicted because on the one hand, I do think PPIs are widely overprescribed and we probably need a lot fewer PPIs. I'm sure you feel that way too. A lot of people who are on PPIs don't need to be on PPIs. It may be difficult for them. They have to lower the dose slowly so they can wean themselves off, but they don't need to be on PPIs. But that said, to fear-monger, which is what this paper does, fear-monger that if you take a PPI, you're going to be more likely to get COVID, especially when the data is so questionable if it's true or not. Somebody put it on the internet well, I think David Cohen, the cardiologist, which was their methodology is basically a marketing survey. They're paying people on PayPal to complete the survey. And if you do that, don't be surprised if people start lying on the survey because, that's what people do. People, if you don't, what do I care what your survey shows? Anyway. All right. But I want to come back to this point on politics and soft targets. And I want to put you down for the record.
You're going to sabotage my career today.
No, we've been talking for 30 minutes. Nobody listens this far in the pod. We have data. No one continues to listen. Okay. Why do you think some people like to talk about these issues rather than get into the technical aspects of medicine?
The parsimonious explanation is that it's difficult to get into the real details of medicine. It's much easier to just go with the hard. A lot of the experts, I see that they just repeat what the hard is saying, but they repeat it to a larger audience in a more emphatic way.
Yeah, more emphatically.
And sometimes they just throw in some of their personal anecdotes. That makes it more emphatic because they have that anecdotes to share as as a part of being the physician. They,
patient. This happened to my patient. Yeah.
Yeah. And if like going into the details of the evidence and to actually discuss the details and the nuances of the evidence, that's a really difficult job. It takes quite a lot of time. Like people sometimes say that, there is a new trial, let's say the olaparib in prostate cancer trial, or Adora trial, and then I say something and people say, oh, it's easy for you to say that, but actually it's not. You have to go into the details of the trial. You have to actually examine it. So, like, in order to be confident about speaking on a particular trial, you have to know the whole ins and outs of that trial, right? And that takes time. That takes resources. You have to concentrate. It's not, and compare that with tweeting.
Congratulations to the investigators. or the latest dumb thing that some dumb politician did. That's easy. That's cheap. Yeah. But that's why it's devolved. Is that more people joined. It's become more political. The difference between politics and medicine is when you have, like, for instance, I think olaparib and prostate cancer is a bad trial. Ian Tannock came on this podcast and he said, the Javelin study might be decent. And I think Javelin is a bad trial. So the thing here is that it's harder to make tribes because we may legitimately have different views about some trials. In politics, there's this sort of, you have to agree with the platform view or you get booted out, and there are all these sort of ways in which they herd you together. But that's why it's devolved. I mean, it's just I don't think...
you give a good example. Like, proper science could be you say that the olaparib in prostate cancer trial is bad, but Javelin is good. That is proper science because you have looked into the study. Bad science, or what politics is, that happens on Medtwitter, is either you say all these trials are good or you are saying all these trials are bad.
Yes, exactly.
So what upsets me is I follow many people I respect, but I know that they are never going to criticize a single trial. And I sometimes think, like, there should be at least one trial that you don't like. There should be at least one trial that has ever been conducted that you don't like. And, there should be at least one targeted drug that you are not happy about, at least one approval that you think is a bad approval. And then none. Like, every targeted drug, every approval that is, oh, this is a wonderful news for the patient. This is a great drug. Like, there should be at least one that you don't like.
Yeah. And, I think it cuts the other way. If they really hold the view that every drug approval is good, which I think many people do, then the question is, all those drugs that were just short of approval, the farnesyltransferase inhibitor, tivozanib, why did we not approve those drugs then? You should be mad. And then at some point you should say, we don't even need the FDA. Just let doctors give whatever drug they want based on whatever they want, because why should the FDA decide? Everything is good if it's approved, so let's just have the most options, which is no FDA at all. So anyway, I'm involved in that TMB debate, which will come out in Annals of Oncology, hopefully.
So that debate was very fruitful. Like,
that was a rare example.
That's what is missing from Twitter. It's good for the audience to learn, as well as good for the participants to participate in the debate when there are. When the opponent, let's say, for the sake of the debate, is throwing data in your face, is throwing evidence in your face, and making genuine arguments. But when the opponent is just saying, oh, what a wonderful day for our patients, what are you going to debate about?
Yeah. All right, let's talk about your papers, which is what we were here to talk about. So you worked on this with a student at Queen's University. Who is this student?
She is an undergraduate student, and this was a little different experience for me because I come from Nepal, and in Nepal, I guess the first journal article that I ever read was after I completed medical school. Before completing medical school, I had not even read a single journal article, and then I come to North America in Boston and now at Kingston, and I see that. Medical students are publishing so many papers. I had not even read one paper during my whole medical school. And here are these young people publishing such fantastic papers in top journals. And that was really surprising for me. It was like a cultural shock.
Well, it's changed a little bit because when I was a student and I trained at University of Chicago, I published 0 papers as a medical student. My first paper was as an intern. So I think everything is moving sooner. It's an arms race, It's just, everything is escalating. So now high school students publish papers and college students publish papers. It used to be you'd wait to be a faculty member, and in the future it's going to be elementary school kids start publishing their first papers. Got to start early.
Yeah, and then when her name is Sophie Effing, the first author of this paper, and when she approached me, she had read some of my papers, and when she approached me that she wanted to do some work with me, I thought she was a medical student. But when I met her, it turned out that she was an undergraduate student. She was not even in med school, and so that was quite surprising for me. That told me that she must be really interested in the type of work that I do. Yeah. Because the type of work that you and I do are not mainstream oncology, right? No. She told me about her interests, and she was genuinely interested in these issues. And I found it very interesting and inspiring that an undergraduate student was motivated to do research. And so, I threw this idea to her, and she seemed interested in exploring this topic. It was a nice experience, and it was especially gratifying for me because she had never published a paper before. So this was her first paper, and then it brought me some bad memories as well from my trainee days when sometimes you would be asked to put in a lot of efforts for a particular project, and at the end you would not have a name on the paper, or you would just be thrown into acknowledgement sections, or you would be thrown into 7th author out of 50 authors in the paper.
I hope you're not talking about papers we worked on back then. No.
No. in the papers that we did together, I was the first author. So there were some bad memories. And then I realized that if I felt bad at that time, now that I'm in the opposite side of the table, now that I'm in a position to train someone, I should definitely make sure that that person does not feel the way that I used to feel sometimes in the past. So, this could have easily been, 10 author paper, right? It's never difficult to have a multi-author paper. You just offer them authorship and they would gladly accept it.
Yeah, send it around for comments. It's only 2 author paper. Yeah, that's right. So that's also unusual. Yeah, you should have put a lot more authors on there.
And that would have been good for my career. People would have been happy. But I thought if I
only when you tweeted "great team effort" when you put the paper out. Great team effort. Team effort.
And I thought that it would be really good for her career if it was just she and I as the authors, because that would show by default that she had put in substantial amount of work.
Yes.
And there would be no authorship dispute.
Yes.
And then this is not a work that genuinely requires dozens of people. This is a systematic review and meta-analysis that 2 people can do.
Yes. And the finding of the meta-analysis is basically you looked at all of the trials that led to Ramucirumab approval, and you find that this is a great example. It's a drug that's consistently improving survival. No PFS, no OS, no surrogates. But when it improves survival, it's always marginal. Tell us about that.
Yeah, exactly. Like, the idea came to me when we were discussing about surrogates in one of my webinar lectures. I was talking about surrogates, and we are talking about surrogates do not predict quality of life or survival. So there is always uncertainty about the drugs that improve, only surrogates. And then one of the members of the audience, who is from the patient advocacy group, she asked me, so does that mean that drugs that improve survival are always necessarily better than drugs that improve only surrogates? And that was a very good question. I didn't have a direct answer. And that led me to think about this type of issue. And then I thought, okay, Ramucirumab is a good drug because it has been approved for so many indications. So that's a good drug to look into. And then I look into Ramucirumab. I knew about how poor quality Ramucirumab is for colorectal cancer and for gastric cancer as monotherapy. But then I started to look systematically into it. And, this is a drug that has improved overall survival in 5 indications. Overall survival, not a surrogate.
Let's go through them. So second-line colon cancer, GE junction.
There are 2 indications for gastroesophageal.
One with paclitaxel, one monotherapy. Okay.
Yeah. It has also received approval for lung cancer.
Well, lung cancer. Oh, right. Yes, in combination with erlotinib, right? Erlotinib, ramucirumab versus erlotinib alone. The PFS.
Yeah. That's the new one.
That's a garbage.
That's the only one.
That's the only PFS approval. Yeah,
that's the only one that is approved on the basis of PFS only.
Okay.
All others are based on overall survival. And then you have, again, in lung cancer, but as second line compared to docetaxel.
That's a marginal survival benefit, yeah.
Yeah. And then you have...
and to be honest, that's in a trial where I don't know what % of people had gotten checkpoint inhibitors in that trial. It's almost out of date, probably. I'll have to take a look.
Yeah, it is. It looks quite ancient now.
Yeah, ancient.
and then in hepatocellular cancer, for patients whose AFP is more than 400.
Oh, that's right. Oh, yes. The second line, if your AFP is high, oh boy. Oh, those are always, we've talked about those trials in our regorafenib paper, and
Yeah, they did the first trial in all comers, and then they saw a signal of benefit in AFP high patients, and then they did a new trial for AFP high patients only. Yeah. And even then the margin of benefit is quite small.
Okay. So what's your takeaway from these studies? So this is a drug that's always marginal, never really great.
Yeah, if you look at the median OS scans, then the median OS scans, it's almost it's less than 2 months for almost all the indications. So this is a drug that improves overall survival, yes, in
select
5
trial
different indications.
In select trial patients by less than 2 months. Yeah.
Yeah, but it always improves overall survival by less than 2 months.
Yeah.
And there is something called the ESMO magnitude of clinical benefit score that gives an idea about how good the drug in the trial is in terms of a particular number. They grade it from 1 to 5 for these non-curative setting drugs. And 1 is the worst score that you can receive. And 5 is the best you can receive. And 4 and 5 are considered to be good, substantial benefit. And Ramucirumab has received only 1 and 2 in all the indications where it has improved OS.
Wow.
And surprisingly, there is only 1 indication where it has improved a score of 3, which is still not good.
Yes.
But that's for the trial where the primary endpoint is PFS and we do not know OS yet.
Oh, yes, I see.
Based on this scale, the score is better for the only trial where PFS is the primary endpoint, and the score is just 1 or 2, the least possible scores for all the other trials where OS is improved.
That's a fascinating. And I guess the other thing that comes to my mind is many of these trials are ancient. Yeah. So the lung cancer trial is ancient. Even the erlotinib trial is almost ancient because all these doctors in the US have switched to Aussie. So that's kind of a moot point based on Flowera. So it's, ancient, but it's a crap. I mean, at the end of the day, I guess the real takeaway point is, if the incentives were right in drug development, this drug wouldn't even be developed. The only reason it's being developed is the FDA will approve every little marginal survival benefit. And so this drug can make billions of dollars, even though people don't benefit. All the money that went into this drug, if you just paid for better nursing care for people with cancer, I'm sure everyone would be much more happy and have a better quality of life. But that's something that we're not going to do. We'd rather pay for this marginal drug.
And we also looked at quality of life, and surprisingly, it has not improved quality of life even in a single trial.
Wow.
So out of the 10 trials, in 7 of them, the quality of life was assessed, reported, and it was not improved.
Wow.
And in 3 of them, it was not even reported.
Wow.
So, and you keep that in perspective when you think about, the side effects from this drug. And there is significant increase in the risk of serious adverse events. And you think about how much we're spending for this drug.
Yes.
And we're spending a staggering amount of money. It costs more than $14,000 a month.
Wow.
And the worldwide revenue in 2019 was almost $1 billion. It was $925 million.
Wow.
For such a drug, we're spending nearly $1 billion every year globally. US alone spends $335 million every year, based on 2019 data. So, what are you gaining from spending that much amount of money?
It's tragic.
So where are our priorities?
Yeah.
And what especially saddens me is, I regularly interact with colleagues from low and middle income countries because I'm interested in global oncology and I do global oncology research as well. And then in some parts of the world, people are paying out of pocket for this drug. That's what saddens me. And when I ask, like, why do you even bother giving Ramucirumab in your country? And then, the commonest answer I receive is, oh, this is a FDA approved drug. So it must be good. Because as we discussed, right, it's very difficult to actually read into the nuances of every trial. So FDA approval, it comes with, people look at it like a benchmark for good quality drug, which is not true. And that has a lot of downstream consequences all over the world. I guess that was one other message that I wanted to give. Like, this paper was not just about Ramucirumab. This paper is about how we should be looking at the whole portfolio of trials for any particular drug when we are making prioritization decisions, especially when deciding whether or not this drug should be made available in a particular country, or this drug should be reimbursed by a particular agency. You have to look at the whole portfolio and see how good the drug is.
Yes, absolutely. Bishal Gyawali, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. I'm sorry we're cutting it short. We're going to record another segment for something we're going to put out in the future. So thank you so much for coming on. It's been a great discussion of Twitter and about this new paper on Ramucirumab.
It has been my pleasure. Thanks for having me. And in case this ruins my career, you owe me to. You should hire me.
How much power do you think I have? That's the real problem. Well, I think you'll be safe. You're protected in Canada. You're in the last bastion of safety. And nobody listens past the first few minutes of all these interviews, so that's another safeguard. But thanks so much for coming on.
It's always so much fun to chat with you. And thanks for having me.
You've been listening to Season 3 of Plenary Session. Plenary Session is produced by Kiana Klossner. Music by Ian Straley and Audrey Tran. The views expressed on Plenary Session are those of whoever said it and no one else. Plenary Session is not medical advice. Follow us on Twitter at plenary_session. Until next time.